It is our #1 threat. And we must acknowledge that. If I'm Iran, and I know that America is totally dependent economically on the use of computers, which we are today, and if I want to take out America and I'm in a country where I don't have that kind of development, I can put a low-yield nuclear weapon on the end of my Shahab missile, mount my Shahab missile on a freighter off of our coast in the Atlantic, launch that missile up into the atmosphere and detonate it and never harm a single person immediately, but fry America's economy, short and long term. And a moral dilemma arises. What do we do if, in fact, a nation state or a rogue state does a limited or a full-scale EMP against us or our allies, where no one is killed immediately? Do we have the moral authority to nuke that nation and kill innocent people? What's the response of our leaders? EMP presents for us a moral dilemma that we have not come to grips with. Our policymakers do not fully understand that nations who strive to achieve EMP capability can bring us to our knees. And yet, what can we do in response? We really don't know, because we don't want to face that dilemma. When we were doing the hearings that I chaired back in the 90s and into the early 2000s, unfortunately, the Pentagon was in a state of denial, partly because the cost to harden our weapon systems was too exorbitant. Now, we did harden all of our ICBMs. All of our long-range missiles in America are fully hardened, so they're protected. But the rest of our systems in the military at that time were totally unprotected. If I'm China and I want to go into Taiwan, I'm not going to invade Taiwan with my military. I'm going to do an EMP over Taiwan, shut down the country, and walk in and take control. That's what EMP presents. And now, it's not just a nuclear EMP. There are threats of non-nuclear EMPs, and now nations of the world with militaries are studying the ability to use directed energy weapons. So now it applies to the battlefield. A whole new set of dilemmas for us. But then there's a good news story here, because Peter's work and the Commission's work, and boy does this Commission deserve credit, they've come up with a series of recommendations. So we know what to do. We know what we can do, and we can do it together. And you're going to find out about that today, and we can start that process right here in Niagara Falls and create a model showcase for the country and the world. But you have to understand one very important fact. I worked in Washington for 20 years. And oftentimes, the last criteria we used to make decisions was logic. Think about that for a moment. Oftentimes, the last criteria we used to make decisions was logic. We were pushed and pulled in every direction by those special interest groups who had their own agendas, sometimes good and sometimes not so good. You might think your government's going to always do the right thing. I'd like to believe that, but I know better. It was logical when I went to Congress as a former volunteer fire chief that we would support firefighters. Yet when I went to Congress, we were zeroing out any money for firefighters nationwide. But the good news is you can do something about it. One person can make a difference. I organized the fire caucus. My staff laughed at me. Members laughed at me. That caucus today is the largest caucus in the Congress with 360 members. Joe Biden was my vice chairman for 20 years. Steny Hoyer, majority leader in the House, is the current co-chairman, as is Al Gore and John McCain. We have supported our firefighters, and the firefighters in this room know that. The point is, you can make a difference. But it's not going to happen in Washington. You've got to make the case across the country with the American people. You own this government. And this government sometimes doesn't move in the direction you want. You can't wait for logic to take place. You as citizens must be engaged. There's no limit to what one person can do. And in closing, I'll give you the advice that my father gave me growing up, the youngest of 9 kids in a blue-collar community in suburban Philadelphia. Neither of my parents went to high school, but my father, who went to the 8th grade, was the smartest man I ever met because he had common sense and he had moral decency. And he said, "Curt, you're going to be the first to go to college." My other 8 older brothers and sisters all had to go in the service first, which is an honorable thing for them to do. I went right into college. He said, "You're not going to go to an Ivy League school." I went to a state university. He said, "You have to understand one thing in America, Curt. It doesn't matter where you're from or who you are. Your only limitations in life in this country are those that you self-impose." That's the message for you. Whether or not we deal with EMP, whether or not we take this issue and make it a forefront issue, is really in your hands. If you organize as you've done with this conference, there's no limit to what we can accomplish, and in the end, we can prevent the kind of Holocaust that many are planning for right now in the capital cities of our militaries around the world. Thank you, and God bless you all.